going on, guys? Welcome to this week's model breakdown for the Travelers Championship. We're going to be looking at key stats, quick recap from our last video, how those stats, when we put them into the model, identify some guys we might like for the week in terms of betting and fantasy, and we'll also talk about how I'm planning on setting up my lineups for the week. I think that there's some interesting dynamics at play in terms of ownership and how we set things up to try and give ourselves, hopefully, an advantage for the week relative to the field. So let's get right into it. So if we look at basically my model for the week, if you'll recall, we're at a Pete Dye design course, so I did input that into the model. I've also brought in bent grass putting, strokes gained approach over the last 24 rounds. One thing we didn't talk about the other day is this is actually a really low scoring event. Typically, we see scores somewhere around minus 18 is the winning score. So it's kind of a birdie fest. So I brought in basically birdie or better scoring. I brought in a metric that's called opportunities gained. It's essentially how often guys are hitting it within 15 feet or so of the hole. So basically who's scoring out high in that regard. I did bring in driving distance as kind of a reference point. I think we talked about in the last video. Not going to look at off the tee this week. I wanted to break it down into driving distance versus fairways gained, put a little bit more emphasis on fairways gained. So you see in this model, everything basically is evenly weighted, but I am kind of visually anyway, putting a little bit more weight on fairways gained. I also brought in our key proximity stats, so approaching the green from 150 to 175 yards, 125 to 150 yards. I brought in par 3 scoring, the long par 3s. If you recall, 7 holes at TPC River Highlands are par 4s between 450 and 450 yards. So I brought that into the model as well. And then lastly, I brought in strokes gained tee to green on at TPC River Highlands. So basically a course history type metric that excludes putting. So when you weight all of these things together in the model, who shakes out as the cream of the crop? So basically, Paul Casey is our number 1 ranked golfer, followed by Emiliano Grillo. Abraham Ancer's coming in 3rd, Kevin Streelman 4th, Patrick Cantlay 5th, Keegan Bradley 6th, my guy Bryson, big beefy Bryson coming in 7th. So just some of the top guys that the model's spitting out. Let's talk a little bit about, how we might use some of this to our advantage for the week. So the odds are out, and I believe have updated or moved a little bit since the last video. But basically, the guys that I am really looking at, so Abraham Ancer is ranking 3rd in the model. In terms of checking the boxes, you'll see a lot of green here on his stats, except for driving distance, which we don't care about as much anyway. But he is number 1 in the field in proximity from 150 to 175 yards. He plays well at Pete Dye courses. He putts well on bent grass. In terms of the last 24 rounds, he's actually gained significantly in terms of strokes gained approach relative to the field. Even at last week's U.S. Open, where he missed the cut, he still gained strokes on approach. So Abraham Ancer is checking all the boxes. I am pretty sure the entire community is on Abraham Ancer this week, but we're going to ride him anyway. Kevin Streelman is really interesting to me. The fact that his odds are so low and his DraftKings price is so high, I think it's going to leave people off of him. I'm not going to bet him, but he's definitely going to make my fantasy player pool. In terms of other guys that I've bet, Keegan Bradley's been playing well for a while now, and that's basically coming through in all of his stats over the last 24 rounds. He's a guy that I did bet at 45 to 1. Siwoo Kim, another guy that I did not bet for the week, although he always has winning upside. If he gets hot with the irons, he can pretty much win anywhere, but he sets up really well for the course, so I'm going to be using a lot of him in my fantasy lineups. I took an approach this week with respect to my betting card where I threw a lot of darts kind of in the mid-range and at the very end of the board, kind of 100 to 1 and beyond. So I have about 14 guys that I've bet on for the week, which seems like a lot, but almost half of them are kind of long shot plays. A couple of them are here. So Harold Varner has been playing well. He's kind of been hit or miss in terms of the results, but a lot of the ball striking metrics that we like to see, he's playing really well and more or less our key stats for the week. So again, kind of the short irons, playing well. Does well on long par 3s. is actually fourth in this field in terms of par fours from our key distance. So at 110 to 1, I like Harold Varner quite a bit this week. Francesco Molinari is another guy that I don't think a lot of people are giving a lot of credit right now. If you recall, when Tiger won the Masters, he actually finished second, and almost ever since then, he's been absolute trash. But over the past couple events, he's actually really picked it up. So a guy that's historically played well on Pete Dye courses and here at TPC River Highlands, he's a guy that I like. So I did bet him at 70 to 1. A little bit further down in terms of the model, I did bet Charlie Hoffman as well at 45 to 1 and Joaquin Niemann at 35 to 1. So in terms of like the, I guess, shorter odds guys, I didn't bet anyone shorter than 28 to 1. And Abraham Answer is that guy. I did cast a couple bets here in this kind of 35 to 45 range with Niemann and Hoffman. And one guy that I feel like is just getting completely disrespected. No, he does not rate out the highest in terms of the stats, but Tony Finau is actually longer odds to win than guys like Brian Harman. And like, that just doesn't make any sense. Tony Finau is a top 10 player in the world. He can play well anywhere. If he can get things rolling with the irons, bent grass is his best putting surface. Tony Finau doesn't win, don't get me wrong. His only win is at the Puerto Rico Open. He's contended a lot of runner-up finishes. He's always played well in majors. He doesn't have many wins to show for it, but I did also bet him at 28 to 1. I just thought he was being kind of disrespected by the betting markets. I don't know if he's going to win. Like I said, he doesn't rate out the best in terms of the stat model, but for a top 10 player in the world, getting essentially 30 to 1 odds, that to me is too good of a value to pass up. So those are some guys that I'm looking at in terms of the model. You'll see I've also flagged some guys a little bit further down. That comes into play a little bit more with respect to some of the fantasy play. So guys like Brandt Snedeker, Kyle Stanley, Brian Harman, Danny Lee. Like, I'm going to be mixing those guys into my model or my fantasy player pool. So just as a way to get some leverage, they should be pretty low owned. They're rating out fairly well in terms of the modeling. Lastly, two guys that I did want to plug because I did bet them. So Guido, I think it's pronounced Migliozzi. So I've been pronouncing his name wrong this whole time. I did put a bet in on him. Again, I don't think he's going to win. Maybe last week, he's going to catch up to him, the grind of it all. But at 100 to 1, I couldn't pass it up. I wanted to make sure to have some Guido exposure. The other guy, Ricky Fowler. So he basically fell off a cliff. He has been playing god-awful. But the last couple events, we're starting to see some signs. So he doesn't rate out the highest in the model. So he's coming in kind of ranked mid-tier, mid-30s. But if you double-click into Ricky's, so we can take a quick look at this. Basically, Ricky's past couple of events, he's really picked it up on approach. He's really picked it up with the putter, which has always been his strength. So Ricky's 70 to 1. I did bet that as well. So just a couple guys that I wanted to highlight kind of further down. I did throw some YOLO bets on guys like Hank Lebioda, who's a lefty. Bubba Watson has won at TPC River Highlands, I think 3 times. He's a lefty, so I did take a shot on him at 175 to 1. Maverick McNeely at 135 to 1. Some of these guys, again, just a little bit of a YOLO play down the board. So that's essentially the model breakdown for the week. You can see some of the guys that rate out fairly well. Jumping over to our fantasy setup for the week. So I've started working through some of my lineups. I'm going to be max entering the small dollar tournament on DraftKings this week. So I'm going to be building 150 lineups in there. I think there's a $20 and $8 kind of large field tournament, so I'll be entering the $8 one. As far as parameters that I'm setting for the week, I try and think about every week a little bit differently. So for this week, I really because there's so many guys that are in play, right? It's a shorter course where approach matters. It really comes down to getting hot with the putter, which is kind of hard to predict. So what I'm doing is casting somewhat of a wide net. So something I don't normally do, but I'm making sure that every single lineup has at least 2 different golfers. And then I've built several rules into this in terms of my generating 150 lineups to basically make sure I'm spreading that net as wide as possible. So I basically want to make sure that I'm grabbing, at least 2 of the studs in my mind for the week. So Patrick Cantlay, Patrick Reed, Paul Casey, Answer, Neiman, Hoffman, Siwoo, Keegan. Like, these are all my favorite guys. So I want to make sure at least 2 of them are on every lineup. The other thing as well, there's a lot of, I think, concentrated ownership this week in terms of a couple key guys. So I think Abraham Answer is going to be probably 20-30% owned in fantasy. I want to make sure that each of my lineups only have at most 3 of these very highly owned guys. So it's a way that, if you think about it, if I have 30 guys in my player pool, there's a bajillion different combinations, right? This is my way of getting at, smart differentiation. So I want to play some of these chalk guys, but I don't want all of my lineups to have 4 or 5 of them in there because I'm not going to be different from the field. So that's the idea. So I wanted to bring in some basically rules or logic to make sure that my lineups are well differentiated. So then in terms of exposure relative to the field, I'm casting a pretty, even spread across the top guys. In the next tier down, doing that as well. But you can see some of these guys trying to just get slightly overweight the field on, but not go crazy. I have kind of my core for the week, and I'm sprinkling in some of these guys that I think are going to be lower owned, like Adam Scott. Rates out decently in the model. Let's get some exposure to him. Guys like Doc Redman, we mentioned Molinari, Harold Varner, right? Guys that I bet. I don't want to be too over leveraged on any of these guys for the week in terms of my total dollar allotment. So basically, I'm just shooting for 20 lineups of each of these guys all the way down the board, right? So hoping to get the right combination of values in here along with the right combination of studs at the top. That's kind of the idea. So hopefully we can do pretty well with respect to fantasy this week, just trying to construct our lineups a little bit differently. So Travelers Championship starts tomorrow, bright and early. I think the first guys tee off at 6:45, so super excited for that. It should be a good event. Again, the course is a little bit more technical. It's going to require precision off the tee, setting up the right angles into the greens, and it'll more or less come down to, of those guys that do that well, which ones find their flat stick for the week. So I'm excited. I think it'll be fun. We got a decently stacked field, not as stacked as the majors, but we got some big names in here. I'll be personally rooting for guys like Finau and Answer to finally break through, but I will not be mad if some of the data guys that we like, Keegan Bradley, Charlie Hoffman, if those guys break through as well. So hopefully we can catch a winner this week. Hopefully we have a profitable week in fantasy. I think that's it for today's video. So if you guys like the content, again, we're in week 2 of this thing. I think we've gotten a lot right. I think we've got, a couple things wrong, but you can't be perfect at this, right? The goal is to get things right more often than not. So if you like the content, if you like the information, if you find it valuable, please subscribe to the page, like the video. And my plan right now is to do an update video similar to last week over the weekend. So probably on Saturday after we have 2 rounds, let's do a quick update, see how our guys are doing, see if there's any value in terms of the live data. So we'll talk here very soon this weekend. Enjoy the first 2 rounds of the event, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, guys.